When it comes to the Europe/Indo-Pacific Balancing Act, stop thinking about the personnel. Start thinking about the materiel. You might remember that at June's NATO summit, Secretary General Mark Rutte said that years down the line, if Xi Jinping ever decided to invade Taiwan, then
that's no doubt he will call his junior partner, Mr. Putin, and make sure that the junior partner in that relationship with China, Mr. Putin, will keep us busy here.
The line received some attention because the
junior partner
phrasing was a not-so-subtle dig at the Kremlin. But in the weeks since the summit, Rutte's claim has drawn some criticism, that Russia and China form a coalition of convenience, and so Xi can get on the phone with Putin all he wants, but Putin is not about to do any favors for China just because Xi asked nicely. And certainly we have discussed plenty on this channel how that is true. However, the conclusion does not follow from the premise. This is not an argument about favors. Instead, it is a reality of wars of opportunism. You likely already know the basics of this if you have been listening to me over the last year or so. The United States gets distracted in the Indo-Pacific, and thus the Kremlin sees a window of opportunity to pull off some operation in Europe, perhaps a gambit in the Baltics. The common counterpoint here among those who prefer a greater focus on Europe in the present is that these are entirely separate domains of operation, and I do not just mean that in a geographic sense. I mean that Taiwan is an island, so it falls under the US Navy's jurisdiction. Meanwhile, Europe is a continent, so it falls under the US Army's jurisdiction. Any overlap is inconceivable. Sure enough, you get a hefty dose of that from the branches themselves. The joke is that the Army could not point to Taiwan on a map, while the Navy is unaware of how the largest land war in Europe since the era of Hitler and Stalin is currently happening in Ukraine. But at the end of the day, those are just jokes. It will not only be the US Navy defending Taiwan. Indeed, other branches will get involved too. That includes the Army, but also the Marines and the Air Force. And those efforts would threaten to strain US capacity over in Europe. So, today, we are going to take a deep dive into the PRC's strategy to invade Taiwan, and how the US Army and others will play a key role in stopping that, all as we take our favorite lines on maps to the Far East, and look at the 5-step process that will define Beijing's plans to invade Taiwan. It turns out that conducting the research for this video was not easy. The perception that Taiwan is purely a naval domain overwhelms any search you might conduct on the subject. But let me tell you about a tool that helped me, the returning sponsor of today's video, ChatLLM Teams. AI can better process natural language than legacy search engines, making it a powerful tool to find information on more obscure questions. Just ask for some useful citations, and as you wish, you can read for yourself the original reports. What makes ChatLLM Teams so helpful is that it aggregates a huge number of AI models together and automatically picks the best one for your question at hand, including more complicated queries involving image and code generation. Best of all, you can get the whole package for just $10 a month, way less than what individual services would collectively cost. So go to chatllm.abacus.ai or click the link in the description to try it out. And thanks again to them for sponsoring today's video. Today's story is fundamentally about these 5 steps. Now, I cannot claim that I know exactly what Beijing's war plans say on the subject. Heck, I'm not even sure that Beijing knows what its war plans would ultimately say on this subject. Truly, I have a dizzying intellect. But at some level, these 5 phases will have to come into play. First, mobilize everything one needs to do this along the coast of the mainland. Second, cross the Taiwan Strait. Third, land on Taiwan's beaches and establish a literal beachhead. Fourth, use that beachhead to offload an ungodly amount of materiel. And fifth and finally, capture the rest of the island. What we will do for the rest of this video is walk through each step of the process, and examine what some of the non-naval branches would need to contribute along the way. I guess you too, Space Force. And in an uncharacteristic show of personal restraint, I will mostly refrain from discussing other things that could happen during the first phase of the war. For example, it is not crazy to think that North Korea might start to get funky around the demilitarized zone, necessitating the rapid deployment of tens of thousands of additional US troops to bolster the more than 28,000 already there. If we really wanted to, we could even extend this conversation out to Australia, a country once entirely peopled with criminals. And while criminals are used to having people not trust them, trust me when I say that going there would be too much work for one video. So let's just try to understand why these 5 phases leave enough work for Washington without additional headaches. We should start with the mobilization stage, because one does not simply invade Taiwan. In all likelihood, this would be the largest amphibious landing in the history of mankind. As a reference point, the Normandy landings on D-Day consisted of about 150,000 troops. Over in Taiwan, we are looking at up to 1 million. Thus, to even begin considering such an operation, the PRC would have to maneuver all sorts of men and materiel into position across the Strait. A common estimate from open-source intelligence reports is that it would take at least a month to do this. Now, Beijing will try to conceal such efforts under the auspices of war games or something to that effect. It will be up to US intelligence to see through the ruse. The upshot for the Western coalition is that the United States has enjoyed recent success on this front. You may remember the Biden administration screaming from the rooftops about an impending Russian invasion in January of 2022, more than a month ahead of time. Well, it is because they absolutely nailed the Kremlin's intentions in the region, and fully recognized what was happening with Russian troop movements, which were small compared to what the PLA would need to do with Taiwan. And conditional on recognizing what is happening, that gives Washington some time to make counter-preparations. Goodness does time matter here, though. You might recall that the Pentagon has a central concern on this front already, which is affecting the calculus of transferring aid to Ukraine today. Taiwan is an island. If it comes under invasion, then the entire region will become a contested battle space. This is not Ukraine, where you can drive things across a NATO border. If you want to guarantee that the materiel arrives, then you need to get it there before the PRC points its bows at the island. And that may get at the central lesson for today. When we think about the Army's role in a war, we tend to think about soldiers on the ground capturing and controlling territory. Sure, that is part of the Army's job. And if you're in the infantry, it is likely what you are thinking about with 90% of your day. But in the modern era of industrial and scientific warfare, the Army is responsible for the deployment of a gigantic swath of weapons systems. Plus, there are all of those behind-the-scene folks responsible for producing those weapons. Later in the video, we will explore specific sets of metal that matter for Taiwan. For now, though, suffice it to say that the United States has a major problem here. It is a legacy of the end of the Cold War leading to lower defense spending overall, and then decades in Iraq and Afghanistan causing the Pentagon to prioritize counterinsurgency strategy rather than raw metal production. As a result, only so many HIMARS exist in the world. Anyone paying attention to the news over the last 3 years knows that Ukraine wants them today, and you can easily infer that Europe would want them in a hypothetical world tomorrow where Russia launches an attack. Indeed, they were recently doing some testing in Estonia. But Taiwan also needs them in the event of an invasion, as well as a whole bunch of other things. Moreover, there are 2 other capacity constraints to keep in mind here. As the PRC prepares for war, there will be a whole bunch of juicy targets sitting along the mainland's coastline. And do you know who might want to go in for a closer look? US bomber pilots. Yes, the US Air Force would play a huge role in an Indo-Pacific War. The closest USAF base is not too far away in Okinawa, and you can imagine the number of aircraft that the United States would rush over there and other nearby bases in the event of a crisis. Given that combined arms maneuvers is the name of the game for US strategy in Europe, You could see how getting tied up in the Indo-Pacific would cause spillover problems across the world. Then there is the question about putting boots on the ground. As it stands, the United States does not have any deployments in Taiwan. That was not always the case, but you have to go back decades to recall an era when Washington recognized Taipei's government as the true Chinese state. As it stands today, the lack of troop deployments is a function of the One China policy. The long-running belief is that, by keeping Taiwan at an arm's length, at least officially, the United States reduces the chances of Beijing staging an invasion. That is why, for example, the United States does not have an embassy in Taiwan. It has the American Institute in Taiwan instead. Side note, they really know how to celebrate the 4th of July over there. That is Taiwan's vice president on the right, by the way, with the Institute's director on the left. Confession, I enjoy going through the president of Taiwan's photo archives. Half of it is serious business, and the other half is completely unhinged. Anyway, the absence of any U.S. bases on the island serves another purpose. It also hedges against Taipei unilaterally declaring independence and entrapping U.S. personnel into defending the island due to a policy that Washington does not support. But given a world where a large mobilization is occurring along the mainland's shores, those concerns will have gone out the window. Heck, the United States has been increasingly breaking One China norms in the last handful of years, well before a true crisis has developed. Even those baseball jerseys could raise some eyebrows. Note that they say Taiwan and not Chinese Taipei. In any case, an impending invasion would begin a time-pressed debate of whether to establish a tripwire force on the island on the fly. Perhaps if U.S. troops hit the ground in the case of an emergency, Beijing will infer that their slaughter will galvanize public support in the United States for a larger conflict against the PRC. Then, internalizing that extra risk, Beijing will demobilize in exchange for the United States withdrawing its forces from the island. How many soldiers would that take? Trick question. The answer may be 0, because Washington may want, say, 10,000 Marines to head there instead, with that branch's expertise in expeditionary missions. And thus begins the first of our manpower crunches for Europe. Sending a larger force to Taiwan before an invasion would be difficult. As a point of comparison, shipping a standard U.S. Army brigade across the Pacific takes about a month, likely too short of a window without exceptional human or signals intelligence that spoils Beijing's plan to launch an invasion. But not to worry, we will get back to the infantry later. That takes us to the second phase of the operation, the Strait crossing. This phase is why it is easy to get caught in the trap of thinking that the Indo-Pacific War will be a task exclusively for the Navy. Well, the Strait crossing phase will indeed be primarily a naval engagement, but we ought to dig deeper into what could happen here. The Taiwan Strait itself ranges from 140 to 220 kilometers across. It is also infamous for being one of the worst waterways to navigate in the world. The only months that are usually clear of wind, fog, and typhoons are April and October. Even then, it is sketchy, and something might randomly delay a planned invasion date. More hope for the United States to buy time. But let's assume that the weather cooperates. Then the plan still must beat the United States shoving every major naval vessel and aircraft carrier into the region to try to halt the advance. Meanwhile, Taiwan will still have a few tricks up its sleeve. For one thing, every centimeter of usable beachhead will be subject to sea mining. But more proactively, Taiwan will launch a bunch of land-based harpoon missiles at high-value enemy ships. That might not sound too concerning for Europe's supply constraints. You can bet against Russia trying to stage a sequel to the Normandy landings from World War II by attacking something along Europe's western shores. A land-based incursion in Estonia or Lithuania is much more likely. But keep in mind that those harpoons could instead go to Ukraine to deal with Russia's Black Sea Fleet, or to the Baltic states and Finland to impose costs on the Baltic Sea Fleet. Regardless, a third option is more immediately problematic for supply constraints. Remember that the strait is 140 to 220 kilometers across. Meanwhile, ATACMS have a range of 300 kilometers. Thus, many of the ports that Beijing would want to use to stage an invasion would find themselves on the HIMARS target list. And we all know that ATACMS are among the most important systems that Kyiv has used in the current war. Well, they would remain as such in a broader war over in Europe. As a result, even the naval engagement creates a clear crunch for the army. But let's not forget about the Air Force here. They have been sitting in Japan for more than a month now, waiting for something to happen. The White House has not yet given them the thumbs up, hoping to not fire the first shot of the war. Now, though, the PLA invasion force is going full steam ahead toward Taiwan. It is time to start bombing mainland targets. Unfortunately for the war planners back at base, though, the attack plan is not that simple. As the recent Israel-Iran war showcased, the key to sustaining bombing operations is to first take out the opponent's air defenses. Then, once you've established air superiority, your bombers can have their run of the place. All of that is a lot of boom that is not booming over in Europe. The real question for the White House is just how far to fly into the Chinese mainland before concerns of nuclear escalation outweigh the benefit. But that would be a topic for its own separate video. It is also one of the many reasons why we will not even consider the United States invading the mainland. Getting involved in a land war in Asia was already the most famous of the classic blunders, and that was before you had to worry about nuclear annihilation. Regardless, the supply pinch starts becoming inescapable once we reach Phase 3, the beach landing. It is worth putting this in the context of the broader plan because timing matters here. The United States may be slow to mobilize its naval response to a PLA invasion, particularly if US intelligence drops the ball. If so, then Taiwan desperately needs to stall to give the United States time to recover. After all, if the Strait crossing succeeds, outside observers will conclude that Taiwan is mostly dead. But there is a big difference between mostly dead and all dead, and surviving long enough for US support to come through will make the difference. As for the battle itself, yep, it is D-Day all over again. Except this time, the democratic countries will have the luxury of fighting from the fortifications. Have fun storming the beach. Well, this just turns into a laundry list of everything that you would expect infantry to use in Europe against Russia. As a starting point, take the T-91. It sounds like a fancy Terminator model, but it is actually the Taiwanese Army's main rifle. Good that they are domestically manufactured, but bad here that they shoot 5.56 NATO standard bullets. Now, it is a sensible decision overall for Taiwan to be linked into all of the Western supply chains. The connection is super helpful in quiet times when you are just trying to stockpile the stuff. But once NATO is involved in a war to protect NATO countries, suddenly the 5.56 NATO bullets start heading elsewhere. Or maybe you need some more stopping power. Then better turn to the 155mm artillery shells that are already famous over in Europe. Wait, you also need to fire the silly things. Better get a bunch of HOUS, howitzers of unusual size. Add the M777 to the shopping list. Of course, the PRC is also probably bringing some heavy metal over as well. You should have some javelins there to counter them. Meanwhile, for all of the Air Force efforts, some of the mainland's planes have made it across the strait. You will want some Stingers to handle those. Oh, during all this time, Beijing is also trying to land missiles everywhere on the island, including along the beaches. Take some Patriots and THAADs as your countermeasures. So, yes, it is a naval battle. Well, until it is no longer a naval battle. At that point, the overlap in army demands between Taiwan and Europe looks similar. Hence, the problems are mounting. Now let's look at the fourth phase, the Materiel Offloading, which I think is the most interesting of the 5 phases from a strategic perspective. The basic problem Beijing faces is that a beach landing is not the capturing of the island. It is the start of a much longer battle. Success over that longer term requires a clean travel line between the mainland and Taiwan to funnel in even more men and materiel, especially the materiel. Soldiers can get on a landing craft and paddle up to shore if they really needed to. You cannot do the same thing with a tank. However, Taiwan is a geographic mess. There are only about 7 deepwater ports around the entire thing. The eastern half's coastline is a bunch of cliffs, and what remains on the western side is very shallow. Needless to say, Taiwan will sabotage those 7 ports to the point of irrelevance. The eastern side would be a bad place to try to stage logistical operations because of the terrain, even if you did somehow manage to establish a beachhead. Plus, the US Navy will have an easier time patrolling that half of the island. It's not their fault that they are the biggest and the strongest. They don't even conduct exercises with Taiwan. But even short on practice, that is enough for Beijing to look elsewhere. And that leaves the rest of the western side. The plan will try to establish quarantine lines running along the northern and southern edges of the strait. That will give the Chinese equivalent of cargo vessels like these the safest opportunity to cross the strait. The standard solution from here would be to use ro-ros, which are not ships that use rows with a W, but rather are roll-on, roll-off craft. They have big doors that allow a tank to roll onto the ship at the harbor and then roll off at the destination. They are very fast when they are functioning properly. One slight problem here. The shores along the western edge are still shallow. Standard ro-ros cannot approach them. Thus, the PRC is currently working on a multi-ship solution. Some say they do not exist, but recent discoveries indicate otherwise. You park a relatively standard ro-ro far off of the coastline, filled to the brim with the metal that you need. With it, you bring 2 more vessels and park them in a line, progressively getting smaller as you approach the coast to avoid getting stuck in the underwater sand. Heck, you might even equip them with onboard jacks to turn them into makeshift rigs, to guarantee that everything goes according to plan. Unlike a floating harbor, you can put together these pieces relatively quickly, and unlike, say, the makeshift harbor recently created along the Gaza Strip, you are out of the water. Thus, you are not vulnerable to the whims of whatever the current decides to do during your offloading operations. All you need to do to complete the process is extend a couple of bridges between the vessels. Finally, put a ramp down from the last vessel onto shore. Congratulations, you have added 180 meters of new clearance. Lo and behold, you can now start offloading everything you need from the bigger ship. There is one massive weakness here, though. These things effectively become stationary when they are in use. Thus, as long as Taiwanese soldiers can find them, they can destroy them. Your pick on how to do that. Harpoons for the ships themselves? Though note that once the ships are jacked up and out of the water, you can no longer sink them as you would a traditional ship. Scoring a hit might disable the ship for future landing operations, but an unseaworthy vessel could still offload its cargo. Alternatively, you could use gimlers for the bridging systems. The whole chain becomes worthless if one of the ships cannot connect to another. But gimlers again invoke some of the weapons that could otherwise be useful in Europe. I have one more point here that further speaks to the interplay of these fronts. You need to spot the makeshift bridges to destroy them, and fast. They are built to get their operations done quickly, and consequently, this is not an easy game of hide-and-seek. Taiwan stretches more than 300 kilometers, so that is a lot of ground to cover. Without a way to cheat the system, Taipei and Beijing would be engaged in a battle of wits, with Beijing trying to hide the location of its offloading, and Taipei trying to locate and destroy the ro-ros. Once they make their decisions, we will find out who is right and who is dead. But there is an alternative solution. Have satellites constantly providing live images of the entire coastline. Then have a combination of humans and AI flag areas of concern, so that a second set of individuals can put those locations under more rigorous scrutiny. 2 problems. 1, clouds that block the view. And no, you cannot just wait until tomorrow to check, because it will be way too late by then. Yes, in the modern era, only a great fool would rely on technology that fails just because the sun did not come out that day. Meanwhile, the second problem is that Beijing may very well try to target the satellites that monitor Taiwan. And while I do not want to bring into the mix yet another branch, you can understand Taiwan's problem here. That is just too much reliance on a technology with too many question marks. Well, the solution is up there. What in the world could that be? Why, it is an ISR drone. You can use them for intelligence, I, surveillance, S, and reconnaissance, R, along the coastline 24/7. The neat thing is that the drones that will serve such a role probably do not yet exist. Rather, they are likely in development in Ukraine at the moment, that country being the hub of all friendly drone development. And the West will be all too happy to learn how to deploy those systems elsewhere when the time comes. Finally, the fifth phase of the war is the island battle itself. This is basically the beach landings all over again in terms of materiel, except the battle would take place over a much longer period. And there is no need for a lecture about the materiel overlap between Taiwan and Europe. Despite those places being on opposite sides of the world, the main needs are the same: 155mm artillery shells, Gimlers, all of the greatest hits. Still, there are some notable extra points here. 1. This will be a long battle. We already saw the mountainous terrain out east. Well, mountains are great places to run insurgencies. And in case anyone forgot, Afghanistan is here to remind everyone. Actually, that assumes that the PLA even gets that far. The capital, Taipei, is surrounded by mountains. It is hard to pick a worse place to invade. The rest of the West Coast does not provide much relief either. Taiwan is densely populated along it, and urban combat is not much fun. 2. Resupply missions will be a challenge here. Yes, the US Navy will still be fighting to break any blockades that formed during the previous steps, but that is a risky and uncertain mission. Air resupply is another option, but it is expensive, cannot move very much at once, and the planes are also at risk of getting shot down. That is why any system delivered before the invasion is effectively worth maybe 2 post-invasion, because many of those late deliveries will never even depart, and some will never reach their destination. This helps explain why the Pentagon gets nervous about dwindling American stockpiles in the present, even if Ukraine is at war today and Taiwan is not. 3. The last-ditch dilemma is whether the United States would want to launch a counter-invasion if the island were to fall. That is a meaty question that I cannot answer at the end of a video like this one. But I can tell you that even trying to bluff such a possibility is impossible if the US Army also has a full contingency fighting over in Europe. I can tell you further that the problem just goes away if Europe is armed to the teeth before any of this happens. Then, when Putin takes that phone call from Xi, and Xi asks for some help, Putin simply says that I am no one to be trifled with, and hangs up. That was the point of the NATO Hague Summit. 3.5% of GDP spent on core defense will do that. We will see if the partners follow through in the upcoming years. Life is pain, and higher taxes make it worse. But sometimes the alternative is even less attractive. Now, if you enjoyed this video, then you will love the 90-minute deep dive I did on the broader prospects of a war between China and Taiwan. Meanwhile, if you do not have 90 minutes of time to spare, but still enjoyed this video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.